Okay. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our program, Abolish Silicon Valley, How to Liberate Technology from Capitalism, with author Wendy Liu, in conversation with Owen Thomas, business editor of the San Francisco Chronicle. I'm Laura Shepard, director of events at the Mechanics Institute. Abolish Silicon Valley is both a heartfelt personal story about the wasteful inequality of Silicon Valley and a call to engage in the radical politics needed to upend the status quo. Wendy proposes ways of developing technology and the tech culture where innovation is conducted for the benefit of society at large and not just to enrich a few. Tonight's program is co-sponsored by Gray Area and the Goethe Institute. Gray Area is San Francisco's leading media center, merging art, science, and technology towards social transformation. Their new initiative, Patch, brings the creative community together to explore ways of connecting and learning through streaming, online education, and virtual spaces. And special thanks goes out to Nadav Hochman, Associate Director, and Matthew Chacon, Program Coordinator. The Goethe Institute is the cultural institute of the Federal Republic of Germany. It promotes knowledge of German language abroad and fosters international cultural cooperation, intercultural dialogue, civil society, and worldwide mobility. And a special thanks goes out to Patina Anka, Cultural Program Coordinator. And the Mechanics Institute was founded in 1854 and is one of San Francisco's most vital literary and cultural centers in the heart of the city. It features a general interest library, an international chess club, ongoing author and literary programs, and of course our Friday night cinema-lit film series, Salon. So please visit all of our websites and see what we have to offer. Today's program will be followed by a Q&A with you, our audience. So please hold your questions until the end of the program. Also, I want to mention that Abolish Silicon Valley by Wendy Liu is available online for sale at alexanderbook.com, our independent bookstore. And now to introduce our guests, Wendy Liu is a software engineer and startup founder who left the tech industry to pursue a master's degree in inequality from the London School of Economics. She has written about technology and politics for Logic Magazine, Dissent, and Tribune, and has been featured in articles on tech worker organizing for the Atlantic and CNBC, and lives here in San Francisco. Owen Thomas is the business editor of the San Francisco Chronicle. He supervises the Chronicle's business and technology coverage. And previously, he was the editor-in-chief of Read Write, a technology news site. His digital experience includes serving as the West Coast editor of Business Insider, also as executive director of the Daily Dot, and managing editor of Gawker Media's Business 2.0 magazine, as well as Red Herring and Wired. Thomas also has a bachelor's degree in East Asian Languages and Civilization from the University of Chicago. So please welcome our guests, Wendy Liu and Owen Thomas. Take it away.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank
Wendy,
you.
So good to be doing this with you. I'm sorry we can't do it in person, but you know, circumstances.
Thanks, Owen. So glad to be able to do this with you, and thank you, Pam, and thank you everyone else, and thank you, Laura. Thank you everyone else working behind the scenes to make this happen. This is a weird time, but we're all kind of adapting.
Yeah, no, it's good that we can still connect and and share ideas. It is ironic, it feels like something biological has forced us into the digital, and there's probably some metaphor there that we can dig into. But Wendy, I want to start with the title of your book. It feels deliberately provocative. It's kind of like you said, abolish Silicon Valley, and then someone said, hold my beer, defund the police. I mean, like we're in this kind of age of like very provocative ideas. but I read in your book that it actually just started as a Twitter joke. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, I mean the joke is already kind of in the name. I just tweeted out one day, we're talking about abolishing things. Let's talk about abolishing Silicon Valley, and then a lot of people just thought it was really funny because I had apparently it there's a lot of energy for saying abolish next to something that everyone hates. But yeah, I mean I think it's amazing that we're at this time where the word abolition is really just in vogue and people are engaging with these ideas very seriously. And, these are not new ideas. People have been talking about police abolition, prison abolition, and, even more broadly, just the abolition of private property and just abolition as a concept has a long history. But I think the fact that, everyone now has at least heard of the idea of police abolition and is aware that there are people who've been working on this for a really long time. That's pretty amazing. And I think it just speaks to the fact that we're in this really weird moment where, all these social systems that we kind of take for granted are just being questioned quite broadly by a large number of people. And that is pretty amazing. And, when I wrote this book, I did not think it would come out during a pandemic. I did not think it would come out during a massive uprising against the police and all these other systems that are entwined with the police. I did not anticipate any of that. And so I kind of just assumed things would go on the same as they had been. And in a way, I'm like, I don't know, I'm very inspired by the fact that so much is changing right now, because I think that's what I really wanted to see. That's kind of the point I was trying to make with the book. And that, the reason it's useful to think about abolishing Silicon Valley, which is, a provocative thing to say, and it's not entirely serious. But the reason we should think about that is just because we have to recognize that all of these systems that we're kind of living under right now, they're all unnatural. They were all constructed. And if we are unhappy with them, if there are people who are, not satisfied with these systems, then we should think about overturning them, abolishing them, changing them. And I'm glad that there's so much buzz around and this appetite for this broader social change that I think we need, because that's really all I'm trying to do with the book. I think sometimes I do regret the fact that I made the title so provocative, just because I think it's easy to dismiss that way. Someone can see it and be like, oh, this is just a person who hates Silicon Valley. And it's like, I don't think that's what the book is about. I think the book it's not a blanket dismissal of Silicon Valley. It's more recognizing that the way Silicon Valley has turned out has to do with this broader socioeconomic system that is itself very, very flawed and is just in dire need of transformation.
I think Silicon Valley, like even the place name, the geonym or toponym of it, is so fascinating because it's silicon and valley. It conveys a naturalness in the very name. A few years ago, the Chronicle staff and I set out to explore and try to see if we could define what is Silicon Valley. It really started because my copy desk kept checking me when I used the term, and they were like, well, no, Silicon Valley is like defined by Redwood City to the west and San Jose to the south and Fremont to the east, and if it's not in that triangle, it's not Silicon Valley. I'm like, well, but like movie studios aren't in Hollywood, but we say Hollywood, and like the banks have all moved up to Midtown, but we still say Wall Street. And is it that like metonym for an industry? Is it a business philosophy? Is it a group of people? I find only in the Bay Area do people really like fuss about where Silicon Valley is, like even the idea that it has a place. But is that where you hit resistance, do you think, where, especially here in the Bay Area, perhaps, where, when you say abolish Silicon Valley, you're talking about, like, to some people that means like, cities, towns, buildings, how do you reconcile that idea of Silicon Valley and like the idea of Silicon Valley that you're talking about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's funny what you're saying is that, there's a conflict between the descriptive and prescriptive view of language, right? It's like, is Silicon Valley what it was originally, or is it something that can kind of expand? And I actually looked at the Wikipedia page and other pages about the term so many times while I was writing this book, just to make sure like can I say this? Will people be mad at me if I call it Silicon Valley? And yeah, I think it's a perennial question. It'll probably never really be resolved. There'll be someone who will be angry at you no matter what definition you choose. So the way I use it is kind of like the way we would use Wall Street.
Mhm.
You know, we don't just mean these buildings. We mean this system of just financial speculation, and it's definitely centered around a particular geographical region, but it's not just the region, right? Like if a big Wall Street bank decides to have headquarters elsewhere, and some of them do have like large offices outside of New York City, we would still think of it as Wall Street. And I think there's a sense in which I mean Silicon Valley as a paradigm and not necessarily just the startups or the companies that are based in the Bay Area. And in that sense, you could have companies following the Silicon Valley paradigm from across the world. And it's still, they maybe describe themselves as Silicon Valley as a thing. And so, yeah, I think it's a useful concept for marshaling together these similar ways of seeing the world, coupled with a relationship to venture capital. It's not perfect. It's a little bit fuzzy. And, we can dispute about whether or not something's Silicon Valley. Like, was Theranos Silicon Valley? Was WeWork Silicon Valley? And the defenders of Silicon Valley will, of course, say the companies that they don't like are not. They'll come up with rules, the whole no true Scotsman thing, right? It's like, oh, this company didn't take money from any prestigious VC firms, therefore they're not Silicon Valley. Or this company's based in, I don't know, Berkeley, so they don't count. And yeah, I think, I don't really want to deal with that. But the way I'm trying to think about it is, let's think about a system that allows certain kinds of people who affect certain kinds of behavior to get very wealthy very quickly and just have a lot of power over how technology is deployed and developed. And this has a massive impact on the world. And I think the reason it's worth talking about is precisely because Silicon Valley is so powerful. If it was still maybe like 30 years ago, I don't think it's as necessary to talk about it. I'm sure I would be glad if someone was, but we're not in that situation anymore. We're living at a time when some of the wealthiest people on this planet have gone wealthy just because of their involvement in these tech companies that are funded through a model that I think of as, the heart of Silicon Valley, where you take venture capital, you grow really quickly, you try to gain some sort of dominance over an industry or a gateway or some sort of technology, and then you just sit at the top of that value chain and you just become wealthier and wealthier. You acquire other companies, you set the whatever labor standards you want, you resist any challenges to break up the company or whatever. And it's a way of concentrating power that I think is has an eerie parallel to these really horrific moments in the past. Let's think about the worst excesses of feudalism. Let's think about the Gilded Age. I think this is kind of what we're living through now. And what's really infuriating about right now is the rhetoric that these companies use. They're just so good at PR, right? They've invested a lot of money in making us think that they're the good guys. And it definitely feels like in the last few years that message is falling apart, especially, after the 2016 election. Facebook, for example, they've really just, started to be clearly like revealed as like the bad guys here. And I think it's much harder for anyone today to be unaware of that. Whereas maybe 10 years ago, Facebook was still young and new. Everyone thought it was fine for the most part. So yeah, I think we're living in this really weird era where it makes sense to talk about Silicon Valley as a system, as a concept, a paradigm, and to feel negatively towards it. I think, most people who I talk to about my book, even if they do work in tech, I feel like they understand why people would be angry at the industry, and they may themselves share the critiques because it's hard to escape the critiques, right? You look around, especially a time like now, when we have the combination of the pandemic and the uprising, and you see all these tech companies profiting from the pandemic, and their billionaire, multi-billionaire founders are getting wealthier while their frontline workers are getting fired or just still made to work without protective equipment. I think really does feel like there's an appetite for this kind of abolition talk, even though it's also more polarizing. I think the people who are insiders, the people who are benefiting from the industry, they're really doubling down, and they're building their fortress. They're saying like everyone who criticizes the tech industry is just they just don't understand anything. They're journalists who are jealous that we're getting rid of their jobs or something. So it is an interesting time to release a book about the tech industry. I'm sure there are a lot of people who really want to read something like this. I'm sure there are a lot of people who absolutely hate it and just are angry that it even got published. So yeah.
It is interesting how, if you poke at Facebook, they'll say, for example, like the George Floyd protests organized themselves on Facebook. Like, there are all these things that they say would not exist, without Facebook. They kind of make Facebook synonymous with the internet. Like, there were email lists, and there were website bulletin boards, and like people had ways of finding each other and organizing before Facebook. So I think there's kind of a claiming of like the upside, the common good, the noble in society, and it's a bit like they're sort of privatizing that public good and socializing the downsides of their decision making.
That's exactly it. Yeah, anything good that happens, they always claim it. Anything bad that happens through their platform, like in Facebook's case, and we can name dozens, they say it wasn't their fault. It was the people who were using it. They were just bad actors or whatever.
We
could
humanity.
Yeah, and it absolutely makes no sense. And I think it's very obvious that it's just completely insincere. It's just a marketing ploy. And I also think it's really interesting that Facebook tries to claim credit for, people organizing protests, or Twitter kind of did the same, during the Arab Spring and Occupy. And, what that really says is that the platform is infrastructure. Because if it's so important that it enables people to do really important things, then maybe it should be treated as if it is just infrastructure. I mean, can Comcast claim credit for people organizing on the internet? Like, should Comcast suddenly become this very prestigious, valuable company because of that? I don't think that necessarily makes sense. Cell phone companies, if you get to the point where people cannot actually communicate and do things without the service you provide, then maybe that service is more than just this thing that a private company should be able to monetize. Maybe it's actually something we should think of as a commons, and something that should therefore be governed in a more democratic way, and not just by some, I don't know, random billionaire who doesn't really seem to have human emotions in any way. Not talking about anyone particular, but.
So Wendy, let's talk about your story. I mean, it's the biographical elements of Abolish Silicon Valley are very compelling. It is kind of, it's kind of a hybrid biography and kind of call to arms, which I think is powerful. But you really bought in. Like applied to Y Combinator. You did a startup. You kind of embraced the status and trappings of being a founder. I guess the question is why? What called to you about all of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I kind of like cringe remembering it sometimes, just because when I was writing this book, I had to reread a lot of my old writing, emails and diary entries, chats I had with people, and just to remember like the way I used to be and the things I used to believe. It's pretty embarrassing, I think. And now, from my current vantage point, I look back on it and I'm like, wow, that was really naive. But at the same time, obviously back then, I couldn't see it like that, and I didn't really see an alternative. Is kind of the best way I would answer that question. I definitely, like, when I was a teenager, there was a period of my life when I didn't really have much going on in my life other than coding and just reading Paul Graham essays and fantasizing about the day I would be able to work at a tech company. And so it just seemed natural to me that I would go down that path. And I bought into the myths because, what else did I have? The rest of my life was extremely unfulfilling. And so I kind of just dove into my computer and tried to get whatever validation I could out of that world. And, that was maybe not something I would recommend. I think it's, I just had very low self-esteem, and I found a place where it felt like that I could somehow compensate for that. And if I just got really good at programming, then I could feel good about myself and I could feel good about the world. So yeah, I mean, just that's kind of a psychological answer, but looking back on it, I think that's just what it was. I felt like the programming world and just the kind of culture around it was a path to just a different way of existing, where I was revered for my intellect or whatever. And I really like that. I love the idea of that. And so I just kind of went along with it. And when you're in that kind of mindset, and there are these powerful people who are writing books and blogs and posting on Twitter about how startup founders are amazing and we just need to disrupt and we just need to build more, then it's, what else are you going to do except believe them? Because in a sense, these people have already been validated by the rest of the world because they have all this money, right? And it's like if you're young and you don't really have a critical understanding of capitalism and the way the world works, then it's very easy to see wealth as a proxy for, I don't know, moral good or something, or at least excellence. And yeah, and I think a lot of the people in the tech industry are quite wealthy, and so when they get on their soapboxes and talk about how founders are the thing that's going to save us, we just need more startups, we just need more disruption, innovation. Why wouldn't you believe that? Like if you don't have a counter narrative, then it's a very compelling idea that, especially if you're the kind of person that they're talking to, if you're, like a young founder with a kind of technical background and you just want to change the world, you don't want to deal with politics, that's messy, but you just want to build something great and be revered for it, then it's like of course you're going to believe it. So I think in a sense, it's almost like, how did I stop believing that? Because I'm not even sure in a way. I think people always ask, like, what was the one moment where you stopped believing it? I don't think there was one moment. I think it was just like a series of small disillusionments. And part of it had to do with the fact that around maybe the 2013, 2014 years, there was a lot of talk about feminism in the tech industry, and the fact that the tech industry was deeply sexist, deeply racist. And you can see this in the stats. You can see this in the reports that a lot of underrepresented people have had of their own experiences in the industry. But of course, many of the most powerful people in the industry either deny it or try to avoid it. Like it's not, obviously it's not in their interest to talk about it. And I remember reading, interviews that these people would do. A prominent VC, for example, was asked why he didn't hire that many women, and he said something about not wanting to lower the bar. And I just thought, wow, that's really revealing, and that's very disappointing. And it was little things like that that just made me feel like this industry was not this amazing meritocratic, gender race blind place that it claimed to be. But it was also more than that, because I mean, with that, I just got a little bit disillusioned with the industry, but it was more like, I thought that if we maybe promoted better people to positions of power, then it would still be okay. And I think what disabused me of that notion was paying attention to what was going on outside the industry. And that means things like Uber drivers. I think in maybe 2016 or 17, there were a lot of stories about how Uber drivers were making less money than they thought they would be. And some of them were starting to commit suicide because of that. And I just thought, wow, that doesn't make any sense to me, because I thought Uber was just about efficiency and innovation. I thought it was just a net good for everyone. So how could this be happening? Maybe these people are lying. I think that was my first instinct, to just be really confused. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized this wasn't isolated. It's not just Uber. It's, it's not even just the tech industry. It's just, there's this really broad, wide-ranging pattern of corporations being extremely greedy and exploitative and finding a way to naturalize that and, just get away with it. And so the more I kind of started paying attention to the stories of people who were actually struggling a lot economically, or, just in the socioeconomic system, the more I realized that, oh, this is just how it has always been, really, and this is kind of the norm. And so it's kind of embarrassing to admit it, but I just genuinely didn't realize how much people were actually struggling for reasons that I could not brush away as, simply like not working hard enough. It was just, the more I paid attention to, the stories of actually working people, it was like, oh, they're working really hard. The system is not set up to channel their hard work into financial stability the way it is for, your typical startup founder. For someone like me, I have a computer science degree. I had a job at Google. I didn't really expect any financial hardship. I figured I would just keep climbing up the career ladder. But then, what is the kind of flip side of that? Well, there are people who are working in the gig economy. There are people who are working at an Amazon warehouse, people who are, farm workers or just working in other countries where they don't necessarily have the same expectation of their financial stability increasing over time. And in fact, they might just have much worse expectations in general of their life progression. And the more I thought about that, the more I felt really uncomfortable with it. And I didn't really know where to go with it because, in a sense, it's like, who am I going to ask? Who am I going to talk to? I talked a little bit to my co-founders about it, and it was kind of like, well, that sucks, but what are we going to do? We might as well just do a startup and get rich, and just focus on ourselves. So yeah, I think it just an interesting journey of paying attention to the world, recognizing just how flawed it really is, and how poorly the systems in place serve most of the people who it's supposed to be serving, and trying to figure out what that meant for me, what that meant for my personal belief in the tech industry, and whether or not there's something I was missing. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so there is another kind of post-capitalist school of thought. I'll call it the Mark Benioff school of thought, for lack of a better standard bearer. He likes to say that companies are the best way to accomplish social change. That basically working within the capitalist system lets you accumulate power and wealth, and then deploy it to reduce harms, to like fund education, to house the unhomed, and he's arguably done that, with his own wealth and with the corporate foundation. It doesn't seem like, though, that there are dozens of companies trying to imitate Salesforce. I mean, does that end up just being like recruitment marketing helping Salesforce hire the next 10,000 engineers it needs to hire?
That's a great question. I'm glad you brought that up. I think there are two ways of seeing this, right? And well, two kind of critical ways of seeing this, and one is a lot more cynical than the other. And I'm sure there's like a reason to be super cynical and think that these people are just completely doing it for marketing purposes. My personal perspective is to be a little bit less cynical, at least of their motives, and to say that maybe these people actually believe it. It is probably what they tell themselves, right? So they can sleep better at night. That the wealth they've managed to accumulate is actually the kind of optimal scenario for everyone, because then it allows them to deploy it towards good causes. And to Mark Benioff's credit, he has at least supported some political causes that his fellow billionaires did not support. Although at the same time, there are things that he could be doing that he refuses to. There's been a big campaign around getting Salesforce to drop its contract with ICE. And, there are people who disrupted Salesforce's annual convention, Dreamforce, recently, and have otherwise been making demands for that. He, of course, is not going to do that. And so I think there's limits to what you can kind of expect of someone in that position. But I think, more just stepping back a bit, I think the problem is that it's very easy to come up with myths to justify your position. And when you're in like a kind of bubble, you can believe really anything. You can tell yourself anything. You can convince yourself that what you're doing is really just the optimal way to do it. And if you insulate yourself from feedback and from criticism, then you're kind of losing the plot. Like you're becoming detached from what the world actually needs. And I think in the case of someone like Mark Benioff or any of these, well-meaning billionaires who are saying that they themselves are best placed to know what is good for the world, I think that's the trap they're falling into, where, they're not the ones who get to decide the direction the world should go into. They're not the ones who should get to decide what other people should be allowed to do and what should be funded and what shouldn't. Unfortunately, they've been given that power, but I don't think it's legitimate. And I think they're trying to, rationalize themselves into thinking that it's legitimate. That doesn't make any sense. Why should Mark Benioff or Mark Zuckerberg, for that matter, get to decide what gets funded. Like, why is it up to them? And, there are all these ways of rationalizing it by saying that they're just smarter, they're just more capable. It's like, well, okay, even if that were true, intelligence can only take you so far. At a certain point, you brush up against just the limits of being able to know what people actually want. And I think there's something in the Silicon Valley paradigm that when that kind of it kind of like corrupts itself and becomes this idea that only you know what people want. So I think something that a lot of startups say is like, your users don't know what they want. You have to build it for them. And there's some truth to that, but the other on when it gets taken to an extreme, it becomes this really undemocratic way of asserting your own power over everybody else just because you can. I think that's the really scary thing about this. If someone declared themselves king and said, I'm just going to do whatever I want, and you just have to listen to me, and if you criticize me, I'm just going to ignore you. I mean, we would think that's probably illegitimate. But then when someone has managed to do that by calling themselves an entrepreneur and amassing, 10% of Amazon or whatever of Facebook, and we just kind of take it for granted as, oh, that's fine, that's normal. This person should have $100 million house. This person should put their name on like hospitals and just be able to control all these philanthropic foundations that are funding things that should really be public services. I mean, I'm going off on a tangent here, but yeah, I think that model is, in a sense, it's better. I would say it's like kind of better than the world where they just don't even pretend. I don't know. Maybe it's better to have a world where they're just they don't even pretend to be to be caring about other people, because then we can at least talk about that more openly and just resist. I am very frustrated with this situation where you have all this rhetoric of these conscious capitalists or like these billionaires who claim to be doing good, and so it makes it harder to say, well, they don't actually care, and even if they did care, it doesn't matter because structurally there's a problem, and that someone who has that much money and is that detached from everybody else is just incapable of behaving in the best interests of everyone else, and they should have just never had that power to begin with. So yeah, I'm kind of mixed minds about that. In a sense, I would love for the conversation to be just more genuine, and can these billionaires just say what they want? Can they just say, I don't really care about you, I would squash you like an ant if I could. I don't care what the little people want, I just want to build my estate in Hawaii and have everybody leave me alone while I keep on ruling the world. They should just say that. I would love that, and then we could kind of have an honest conversation. But instead, they cloak their power under, they like whitewash it. They have this, they're pretending that they actually care about what's good, and maybe they do believe it, but I don't think it can be genuine in a larger sense, because I don't think they're capable from their vantage point of knowing what actually constitutes the greater good.
I think it's very interesting to look at the case study of Jack Dorsey and his philanthropy, because when Square went public in 2015, he promised to set up a foundation, and he never actually did. And several years later, I kind of stumbled across this fact and reported on it and got a lot of blowback because, it's like, well, you can't prove he didn't give the money away. He just did it in this kind of like very hidden way. He used vehicles that were opaque and didn't have to report, tax filings. And then, earlier this year, he came out with essentially a reboot, a pivot, a reinvention of his giving called the Start Small Fund, which was what he had promised originally. But I ran the math. He kind of wowed everyone by saying he was going to give away $1 billion. And it turns out that if he'd actually followed up on his initial promises, he would have given away $2 billion by now already. And actually, Square's stock has run up so much that money would have been worth $4 billion. The shares would have been worth $4 billion. So, like, did he give away $1 billion, or is it actually negative $2 billion? How do you account for that? And how do we hold how do we hold these billionaires accountable when it's all voluntary giving? It's all kind of their largesse and they want something, right? They want credit, they want respect, they want social standing in exchange?
Yeah, yeah. I think, the answer is we gotta take away their money. Sorry. Like I don't think anyone should be a billionaire. And I'm saying this with respect to the current socioeconomic system. I'm not saying like in theory no one could ever be billionaires if everyone was a billionaire. It's more just like I think this is a worthy slogan, abolish billionaires. If we're gonna abolish things, we should definitely have billionaires on that list. But yeah, I don't think it makes sense for anyone to have this much power. And in the in Silicon Valley especially, most of that wealth comes in the form of stock, and sometimes it's private and you can't really liquidate it that fast. But to kind of address that, I guess I would say is we need a different system for you know doing ownership of companies and and valuing companies. This doesn't make sense. So the fact that you can be a billionaire like Travis Kalanick. I don't know if he's still a billionaire, but for a while he definitely was during Uber's IPO. The fact that he could just mint fantastical amounts of money because of a company that he wasn't even involved with for over a year because he kind of left under this cloud of just a little bit of disgrace, really. That just makes no sense, and that completely has to do with the cap table and who owns shares in that company. And it's just this whole system for creating wealth by giving people shares in companies that might go on to become trillion-dollar companies. Like it's ridiculous. It maybe makes sense on a very, very small scale when Silicon Valley is small. When you get to the point where you have these huge trillion-dollar companies that are just sucking up all the air in the room, it doesn't make any sense. And it's, this feels like a case of a model being misapplied. And it's horrible. And I think it's really sad that this industry has, just gotten all these people to believe in it, especially young people who are coming out of school and want to do something with their lives. And to a lot of them, Silicon Valley seems like a reasonable bet, partly because you get to maybe make a lot of money, but also because it feels like that's the best way of scaling anything, right? Like if you actually want to make an impact, are you better off starting a company, or are you better off doing something that means something to you? Well, if you start a company, you might actually make it really big. And unfortunately, we're living in this landscape where that is often the best way to do things, not like from a moral standpoint, but just from an outcome standpoint. If you want to raise money for something, it's much easier if you incorporate as a Delaware C Corp and have like a technical co-founder or something, and you talk about how you're going to break into this billion-dollar market or something, than it is to start a nonprofit or to start start a worker co-op or something. It's just the money flows towards companies that have this very lopsided, share distribution system. And it's just, we take it for granted because it's like a norm for, the founder and the investors to get the lion's share of the rewards. It really doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't make sense that Jeff Bezos, has $100 billion or whatever of Amazon stock, when, yeah, he was instrumental to the founding of it, but so were a lot of people. People have been there for varying lengths, and it's not like he is the one delivering all the packages himself. He happened to take part in the initial creation. But I think, I'm definitely going off on a tangent, so stop me if you want. But I think what this comes down to is this like larger system where we valorize people who are present at this initial moment of creating something, and then that kind of gives them cover to profit from it like forever. And it doesn't make any sense. A venture capitalist who invests in a company and a small amount of money into a company, that company happens to take off, the venture capitalist could make 1,000 times their money for doing what? For just being there at the right time. And someone who was an early employee, maybe even quit and isn't there anymore, can also, just because they've been given a certain amount of shares, make a ton of money. That doesn't really make sense. I think from the perspective of equity, from the perspective of efficiency, that's no way to run an economy. Just giving people outsized rewards from an early role in creating something. And it's like, well, if it's great that they created it, but surely after a certain point, it's no longer their creation. It's not just theirs. It becomes a creation of a lot of people, the many thousands of people who are keeping Amazon running today, for example. And yet Jeff Bezos still gets to claim just a massive share of the rewards, and we kind of take that as normal.
So if we divorce technology from capitalism, there is an example of that, right? Wikipedia. It's a free encyclopedia run by volunteers. And yet its culture is deeply sexist. It, it has systematically kind of suppressed underrepresented minority voices. It was founded by a white male who kind of replicated power systems that, that advantaged geeky white males like him. A certain argument, a certain style of like online argument that was, that I think Jimmy Wales didn't even see as like, gendered or racial or, kind of baked into the existing power system. And yet there we are. So, I know in the book you propose this idea of nonprofits or worker cooperatives. Aren't you worried that they could be just as poorly run and like socially malign as corporations?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that's not necessarily a given, right? And that's kind of why when I talk about abolishing Silicon Valley, it's not just, changing the models of these companies, it's changing the social fabric. It's about really just changing, challenging all the things that we find suboptimal in the socioeconomic system that we've been given. And so I think I see Silicon Valley as part of that, but it's by no means all of it. And I think the idea of abolishing Silicon Valley works hand in hand with a lot of other radical political rallying calls that have definitely, just been like in the air lately, like police, as we were talking about earlier, like prisons, ICE. Part of the reason I even came up with the idea of abolish Silicon Valley is because right around that time there was a lot of talk about abolishing ICE, and I think that's the idea of abolition is unfortunately a very powerful one right now, because I say unfortunate because what it reveals is that we've built up all these systems that are no longer adequate for the kind of world that many of us want to build. And it feels unfortunate because it feels like, oh, why are we wasting our time destroying things when we should be building? Which, one prominent venture capitalist who I will not name seems to think we should just spend our time building. And it's like, well, what are you building? Come on, like, what are you building that's so important? Are you so sure that the thing that you want to build is actually what we need? Or are we at a time where we need to really reevaluate what already exists and figure out what we should be building next? I think part of the problem we're in now is that we've just built too much of the wrong stuff. And, like social systems, but also like physically, we're building all these things, taking them from, taking resources from the planet, building them, dumping them to landfills. And it's like, what? That's like the best metaphor I can think of, just for how building too much can sometimes not be great. We're in an ecological catastrophe right now because we've just been building the wrong kind of thing. So, yeah, and I think, I mean, just to return to your question, the Wikipedia model is not necessarily one that appeals to me that much. I mean, I think when it comes to different models for running tech companies, I'm more interested in the kind of broader changes that would allow that to happen rather than the specifics of how a tech company could be converted to a co-op or a nonprofit. I mean, I think that's interesting. It's just right now I'm thinking like, how would the balance of power between capital and labor have to change? What kinds of social services and public services would have to exist so that companies like Uber don't exist? What kinds of like infrastructure could we have instead? So yeah, I think it's a good question. I don't know if I have a great answer to that, but to address it, I would say, well, I mean, it's definitely very important to tackle sexism and racism and all these other kind of social ills that have proliferated.
Well, I'm not sure we'll have all the answers tonight, but I think we've got a lot more questions than I have. I see them piling up in the chat. So I think this might be a good time to take it over to our audience questions. And Laura, I believe we've got Pam ready to.
Yes, Pam's going to come up, and Pam Troy, our events assistant at Mechanics Institute, is going to read some of your questions and pose them to both Wendy and Owen. So Pam, take it away.
One of the first questions appeared in the Q&A window, and I'm going to try to word this carefully. Hi, thanks for this talk. On Friday, our company was acquired. Our new boss is one of the richest and most egregious business people in the world. My question is, how can we continue our social justice work inside lower management of the world's hugest industry killer and wealth eater? Grateful for your work.
Oof. First of all, I'm so sorry. That's awful. I wish you the best of luck. I think I don't really know if I would be optimistic in that situation, but I guess, if I were in that boat, I would do my best to kind of build power with my colleagues. Like at least like talk to, if you can't talk to your coworkers, see how they feel about it. Are you all, on the same page about this? What are their concerns? What are their issues with this acquisition? And can you kind of build common ground? Can you build power as a unit so that if management wants, or like if your wealthy boss wants to retaliate at some point, it becomes harder. Because other than that, unfortunately, I don't really know what else there is. I think this is one of those situations where your options are pretty limited. But if you do like your job and you want to stay at the company, then I think you're going to have to. You probably are already aware of how it could be very difficult. But at the same time, I think, the one option I would always reach for in a case like that is try to build power with your coworkers. There is a long history of people who have turned to the labor movement in some way, whether by forming an actual union or just by kind of building power in a more informal way. And I think that's a really important history to understand and engage with, because I think you'll find some very similar situations there. But other than that, I don't know if I have great answers for you. I wish you the best of luck.
Okay, the next question is from Jolene. Did you interview any founders for this book?
Oh, I guess I'll answer that. So the book is a memoir. It's not really like an interview, a sub-series of interviews. It's not really a reported book. It's a memoir about my experience as a startup founder. So it features, my own perspective, and it also kind of touches on what's been happening with some of the other startups that were working alongside us and that we were partnering with. But it's mostly just about, my own personal experience as a founder.
And another question, this is from Sydney. Sydney actually has 3 questions, but I think you might have already covered the first one when you answered the first question. One of her questions that I think is very good is, what reactions do you think capital will take to growing disenchantment among tech laborers?
Ooh, great answer. I think we've already kind of seen the beginning of it. You have companies like Google that are just really cracking down on organizing. And I think we're going to see more of this as tech workers become more disillusioned with their workplaces and with, what their bosses are doing, and they start taking increasingly radical actions to challenge it, whether that be writing open letters or doing walkouts, going on strike, just talking to the media, like doing more leaks. I think more and more of this will happen because this is kind of the way the water's flowing. And as this happens, I think management's going to crack down. I don't think they're going to just say, okay, you can have it now. You can do whatever you want. I think they're going to respond with repression, because that is what capital has always done when workers start organizing. So yeah, I think that's definitely a thing to be concerned about. I don't know if there's any way around it. I think things will probably have to get worse before they get better. I also think so beyond just, straight up repressing workers who are organizing, I think they're also going to do their best to shift labor to other cities, other countries, places where they think workers are less likely to rebel, and also, don't demand great wages, and where they're just lower labor standards. And we've already kind of seen some of this happening. It's been happening in a lot of other sectors in the tech industry. In the prestigious companies, at least, like they haven't really been openly doing this as much. Although, in the case of a company like Google, Microsoft, Facebook, they all have huge contractor workforces. But I have a feeling, just this kind of what a lot of people are saying, that in the next couple of years, we're going to see more outsourcing to countries in Eastern Europe, to parts of Asia. And, this is, again, not a new trend. It's something that's been happening in the tech industry overall and in other sectors for a while. But Silicon Valley so far, they've kind of built this brand as being a place that pays their workers well, and, really just tries to value their employees. And I don't think that's going to last forever. I think eventually and we're already kind of in the middle of this, eventually they're going to get to the point where they say, we don't actually care about paying our workers well. We'll pay maybe like 10% of our workers really well. And then they will build tools to surveil the rest of them who are working in some factory somewhere where there are no labor standards. And, that's kind of the dystopian future that I think we're headed towards unless something changes, because this is just the way the pendulum is swinging. So that's my kind of gloomy prediction. I hope that won't happen, but it feels like we're already on track to that happening.
Wendy, do you think that the current trend of remote work, which the pandemic has accelerated, but it was here before, is that going to make it harder for workforces to organize, for workers to kind of like find each other and connect, especially in ways that aren't easily digitally surveilled?
Yeah, I think that's possible. On the other hand, I do think there is hope for organizing in a very digital context. I mean, a lot of the digital media organizations, some of them only knew their coworkers through Slack, but they were still able to unionize at like BuzzFeed, for example. And I think that's something to keep in mind, that even though the terrain is shifting, that doesn't mean it's hopeless. And surveillance is definitely an important thing to consider. But, I think a lot of people who are working especially at tech companies, they're quite tech savvy. They know how to, at least they're like thinking about ways to evade surveillance. But I think, overall, this pandemic is going to function as the perfect alibi for doing more like outsourcing, because, you can just say, oh, well, these jobs are already remote, so we might as well, like our shareholders or our investors they're trying to push us to save money. Well, we're just not going to hire anyone back that we've laid off. And we're instead going to hire, 10 times the number of people for the same cost in a different country where we don't have to worry about them unionizing or, demanding good benefits or anything. So yeah, and someone pointed out in the chat that Amazon is already kind of here. Like, yeah, for sure. I mean, Amazon is just really really good at this model. That's how they've become, among the most valuable companies in the world, by finding a way to harness some labor and pay those workers really well, treat them really well, and get them to build things that will surveil and dispossess other workers. And this is just kind of the logic of capitalism. Like, if you want to win at capitalism, you have to do this, unfortunately.
Well, so this might lead us to a more upbeat discussion. How might we reshape the technology we use to be pro-social and fulfilling?
Wow, that's a good question. Owen, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I think back to when I first got to the Bay Area in 1995. I mean, it was, a bit hippy dippy utopian. I hung out with a group of young people. We called ourselves the Cyborganics, and we were trying to, figure out like what culture and society would look like. And there was also a company on the side, and it was going to do like, internet cafes or something. But I think the capitalist part of it was kind of an escape hatch or a release valve. It was like, well, if this doesn't work out, we can always do a company. And if you look back at the history of Silicon Valley, like there's a strong connection to the 1960s counterculture and like the idea of technology as personal and societal liberation. It took what Silicon Valley did was it took an industry that was like built around like centrally maintained mainframes and said, here is the personal computer. And I mean, Wendy, this is a lot of what you write about, is like, getting that first computer, like that used laptop that you had, how like liberating and powerful that was. If anything, part of the problem of the present moment is the degree to which, cloud computing and machine learning have kind of re-centralized resources. So you can't really do technology now if you don't have a cloud, if you don't have massive amounts of consumer data that you got through questionable privacy practices. Like, if you don't have that stuff, you can't play with like modern technology. And that's like, I think that is, I mean, I make fun of blockchain, aficionados, but I also see that like part of what attracts people to like that kind of idea is like maybe here's something where there's some personal freedom of action and creativity and like, you know, lack of central control and enforcement and oversight. And you know, I think maybe we need I mean the frontier is like a deeply problematic metaphor, but like, you know, is there some kind of, you know, space of like freedom, you know, is there, you know, is there that place to operate where, you know, you're not, you know, you're not oppressing someone else, and but you also don't have to get permission from someone to, you know, to tinker around and create. I don't know if that really answers the question, but I mean that's I guess what it sparks in me is like, how do we get back to that feeling of like Wendy as a teenager discovering like HTML source code for the first time and like looking at the angle brackets and like decoding it and feeling liberated. Like, is that, you know, can we get that part of technology without the hyper capitalism?
I love that because I think, I mean, that's a great point of the fact that everything feels so centralized these days. And it's not just that it's centralized, it's that someone else wants it to be there, not you. So you open up, you know, basically any app website and it's like everything on there is there because someone else wants you to see this. Maybe it's, you know, the algorithm wants you to see things that will make you engage with it more, or it's an advertiser that just wants to steal a few seconds of your time so you can click on their thing and buy stuff. And there's a sense in which that feels like you no longer have control. You're not the agent here. You're just along for the ride. And that really takes away some of the freedom that I think a lot of people felt in the earlier days of computing. And, you know, instead all that freedom has been handed over to these corporations that with these billionaire founders. And it seems like they don't even necessarily know what is lost. And like many of us don't even know what is lost now, because I think we're all just so used to this world where all of our smart home devices are controlled on some centralized server. And, you know, we have no idea what's done with the data. And this is just kind of the world we're used to. But yeah, I think I would love to have a more decentralized model of technology where we have more control over the things that we use. Like I don't actually have any smart home devices, even though I like the idea of them, because I don't trust any of these companies, not just in terms of data, but also just to like build the right features that I want. I would love the ability to tinker with them. And for many of them, you know, there's a limited amount of things you can actually tinker with. On my iPhone, I have so little control over how it looks. I just have to trust that some app developers doing the right thing. And, you know, this is just kind of the model that we're in. And in a sense, I understand why it's the way it is. But I think this is a model that goes hand in hand with, you know, just the broader economic system. And when you have all these companies that are trying to seize control and like become bigger and bigger through dominating user patterns and, you know, ensuring that their customers can't switch away. And it's like, that's what's good for these corporations isn't good for us as consumers. We don't want a world where we are addicted to our apps, where it's very difficult for us to switch platforms, where we just absolutely can't choose what we do in them. These companies want it, but, you know, we have opposing interests. And I think I would love to see a world where it is more decentralized and we as users just have more control over what we can do. And I think it will take quite a fight to get there. It will probably require new forms of organizations and just new ways of coordinating things. But I think that is worth pushing for.
So from your experience, Wendy, from London School of Economics, what specific steps of change would you advise a tech CEO, if you could, of your choice?
Oh, it's a good question. I think, yeah, in a sense, I don't know if I'd have much advice for a tech CEO in particular, other than I guess it kind of depends. You know, there's a wide range of tech CEOs. They're the ones who are running very small companies, don't really do a lot of bad things. And then they're the ones who have built multi-billion-dollar empires explicitly through just exploiting workers. So yeah, I mean, to the latter kind of CEO, I would say, well, I don't know, let your workers unionize, sabotage your own company and until you get to the point where you have less power and your workers have more power, because part of the problem is that, you know, workers just don't have enough power. put your company's resources towards, I don't know, fighting for progressive causes in whatever way you can. And when your shareholders inevitably oust you, then, just take the L and just call it a day. That's kind of the advice I would give. It's mostly glib. I don't expect anyone to follow that. And then for tech CEOs of smaller companies that are not yet at the point where they have to really sell out their soul, I would say, do what you can. See what are the values that you actually want your company to embody, and how does the larger socioeconomic system prevent you from fulfilling those values? And then, figure out where you can actually make change in a way that you believe in. But be very realistic about the fact that we are all living in this system that does not care about any of our values, and it will crush your values if those values are not aligned with the need to make profit. And so I think, to a tech CEO, be realistic, treat your employees well, recognize that they're giving up, a large proportion of their finite lives to work for you and make you wealthy, and they deserve probably better than you've given them. Unless you're all making the same amount of money and have the same amount of stock, they probably deserve better. And recognize that at the end of the day, it is just a company. Don't work yourself too hard. Don't be too hard on yourself if things don't go that well. I've been there. I really thought that when my startup failed, that it was the end of the world, and that is that important. It wasn't important. What I was building was not important. And the last thing I would say is, if you feel like you don't believe in what you are building, that is a good sign that you should not be building it. Because you don't have to do it. You don't have to do this as a rite of passage. It's not something that you have to devote 5 years of your life to or whatever just to be able to be treated with respect in the industry. There are other ways of living life than trying to make it in this really insular and just really messed up industry. So be easy on yourself. Think about what you actually want to achieve, and if the startup is not the right vehicle to do that, then give yourself the option to take a step back.
This question is from Yuqing Zhao, and it's to both of you. Do you have any suggestions in terms of skill sets to acquire for people to get more involved in abolishing this Silicon Valley paradigm? I guess regarding both technical skills and from a policy legislative perspective.
Wow, amazing question. I love it. Yeah, so in terms of technical skills, I mean, if you like working in tech and you like the kind of work you do, then be good at it. Just follow your heart, do what brings you joy, do what you think is useful and what you find fulfilling. That's kind of the best advice I can give on that front. But in terms of policy and politics and sociology, read history, pay attention to how we've been in similar moments in history and what people have done. And especially, I would definitely recommend labor history. I think this is something that definitely people in the tech industry are unlikely to be attracted to, just usually, but I think it's super important. It's especially because we're living in a moment when a lot of tech workers are unionizing and otherwise trying to organize as workers. There are precedents to this. This is not a completely new thing. People have had similar objections to prior moments of organizing. And if you look at America in particular, and the New Deal era, which is touted as this amazing moment of progressive policy making, I think it's important to remember that there was a lot of labor organizing happening, and that some of the amazing gains that have occurred would not have occurred if workers didn't themselves get together and organize and build power. Because it's not just about policy changes from above. That's part of it, but there's a lot of it where I think it's easy to forget that so much of what has been built in this country and many other countries is not the result of some genius who comes up with this brilliant policy. It's a result of people coming together and trying to build power in whatever place they're in, using whatever leverage they have. And this, when I say like this, it sounds a little weird, but I mean, I think the most fulfilling thing for me in the last few years has just been learning about labor history and recognizing that, and not just history, and recognizing that there are people who are organizing right now and they are building power using the tools available to them. And it's really inspiring. And if enough people do that, this actually completely shifts the political atmosphere. It really, really changes things. So yeah, I mean, I would say to people who want to abolish Silicon Valley, first of all, read history, read about labor history, read about, any kind of radical political stuff that's happening. I think there's like a lot to learn from history in particular, and just from people who've been theorizing about things like police abolition. And it is very valuable. And if you haven't done this already, then I would highly recommend it.
So we have one more question from Samantha. Do you think any of the major companies that have made public supportive Black Lives Matter statements will actually take any meaningful action?
Oh, great question. No, I don't. I think they'll do window dressing. Maybe they'll shuffle around some people or put out some more carefully worded statements, or maybe they'll put out some, I don't know, diversity initiatives that don't really accomplish anything meaningful. I don't think we're yet at a point where these tech companies feel like they actually have to do something. I think they feel like they have to make a statement. I don't think they recognize that more is required of them than simply making a statement. And but I do think that if this movement keeps building and keeps pressuring people at these companies, then I think we'll maybe see some substantive change. I just don't think that these companies are going to do it of their own accord. We're not quite there yet, but they might if they feel threatened in some way. Like if there's a chance of losing market share, or of workers going on strike, or politicians are going after them, then maybe we'll be at a point where these companies realize, oh, we actually have to pay our Black workers well. We can't just put out a statement saying we care about Black lives. Yeah, I don't think they're at that point yet.
I think there is one thing that is kind of a core cultural value of Silicon Valley that is to the good, and that is labor mobility. I mean, one of the founding stories of Silicon Valley is that you had the traitorous six who left one semiconductor company to start their own, and then they left that company to start Intel. And of course, that's all kind of in that founder-driven capitalist model, but it still is a statement that like you can leave a company that doesn't meet your values and start one, or start or join another, or start a worker co-op. I think if the if there's one thing about Silicon Valley you don't want to abolish, it's that idea that like you can pick up and leave, and it's a really powerful element. It's voting with your feet. So I think that might be one way that we bridge our way to a new Silicon Valley if we have to abolish this one.
Yeah, I mean, just to add quickly to that, I think it is good that there are people who are able to leave their companies if they don't agree with it. I think, unfortunately, that's not available for everyone, which is really, really sad. People who are on visas often have a really difficult time leaving. I've, just heard so many horror stories of people who are working in these companies in really horrible, toxic environments. They feel like they can't leave. And it's not even just, the extreme cases that sometimes you're worried that if you leave for another job, it'll look bad for your resume, and maybe you just won't get hired anywhere else. And also, what if you don't find another company that matches your values? And I think but yeah, I think this might be an avenue of change for these companies, where if enough people start leaving, like high profile people start leaving, and new people aren't joining, then maybe the executives will finally say, oh, well, we have to change our policies. But at the same time, I don't know if I would count on enough of that happening anytime soon. Fortunately, maybe Facebook. Facebook seems like it's pretty close to the tipping point.
Okay, well, with that, I'd like to thank Wendy Liu, author of Abolish Silicon Valley, How to Liberate Technology from Capitalism, and our host for the evening, Owen Thomas, business editor of the San Francisco Chronicle. Thank you for a very provocative conversation today. And I see a lot of comments in the chat, so just folks keep the conversation going. And we look forward to seeing you at our next Tech in the City program. And again, much thanks to Gray Area and to the Goethe Institute, our co-sponsors for tonight. And books can be found at alexanderbook.com if you want to purchase a book. And once again, thanks everyone for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you very soon again.
Thank you. Thanks, Owen.
Thanks, Pam. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks all.